Oil lies at the heart of the war that Russia is waging. It not only serves as one of the country's greatest sources of income, but it is also refined to produce the fuel that Russia's forces rely on for tanks, jets, trucks and other equipment. As one analyst put it early in the campaign, oil means everything to Russia. He continued, it's both one of the country's greatest sources of income and it's refined to produce the fuel that Russia's forces need for so much of the equipment they use in Ukraine. Without that refining capacity, Russia lacks everything from diesel that makes its tanks run, to gasoline for its people, aviation fuel for its jets, and even lubricants that keep much of its equipment in good condition. The logic is simple. If you deprive an invading power of fuel, you choke its machines. If you block refined oil, you stop the tanks, you stop the planes, you stop the supply lines. And when Russia is being deprived of its oil money, it cannot even build or maintain the equipment that runs on those refined products. As one commentator explained, that knowledge will make the last few days especially devastating for Russia. He went on to say, in a double blow to Vladimir Putin's invasion, Ukraine has once again struck deep inside Russia. Only this time, it's done it as China abandons Russia, perhaps once and for all. Let's start with Ukraine's strike. On November 11th, reports surfaced that Ukrainian forces had launched a flurry of strikes deep inside Russia, all of which targeted the country's oil industry. Among the targets were the Saratov refinery, which appears to have become a repeated target of Ukraine's drone strikes, as well as the Orsk region refinery, and a sea oil terminal in occupied Crimea used by Russia to ship oil to its dwindling list of customers. These operations send a clear signal. Ukraine is now capable of hitting key oil logistic nodes far behind the front. All three of Ukraine's strikes deserve attention, though the Saratov attack exposes Russia's vulnerabilities in more ways than one. In its reporting on the strike on the Saratov oil refinery, the Moscow Times noted that the attack, which occurred during the early hours of November 11th, represented the fifth time that Ukraine struck this particular facility in the fall, and the seventh time so far in 2025. Expand the scope to all of 2025, and Saratov has had key infrastructure repeatedly targeted by Ukrainian drones. A valid question arises, what are Russia's air defences doing to permit so many direct hits to a refinery of such importance? Russia's own defense ministry claimed that on the night of these attacks, its air defences had shot down 37 Ukrainian drones, including 8 over the Saratov region. But what followed was telling. Instead of acknowledging damage to the refinery, the regional governor, Roman Busargin, claimed that Ukraine's drones injured one civilian and shattered windows in several homes. He offered no mention of a refinery strike. Meanwhile, Ukraine's general staff shared a photograph of the refinery burning and reported a series of explosions followed by a massive fire. So while the full scale of damage is still being assessed, the key point stands. Ukraine's drones got through, struck the target and ignited a blazing fire. The refinery in Saratov, which, according to Ukraine's general staff, produces 20 types of refined oil products, including gasoline, diesel, vacuum gas oil and technical sulfur, plays a direct role in supplying Russia's war machine. Any hit on Saratov is therefore an attack on Russia's ability to sustain its offensive in Ukraine. Another of the strikes in Russia's Orsk region appears even more impactful. According to Ukrainian sources, the Orsk Nefteorg Zintes plant has a design processing capacity of 6.6 million tons of crude oil per year and can produce more than 30 types of oil products, including gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, kerosene, and lubricants. Combine that with the 4.8 million tons processing noted for Saratov in earlier reports, or up to 4.8 million tons per year in 2023 as cited, and you have a significant swathe of refining capacity under assault. In the words of the Ukrainian General Staff, as part of reducing the enemy's offensive potential and complicating the supply of fuel and ammunition to the military units of the occupiers on November 11th, units of the defense forces of Ukraine hit the facilities of the Orsk Nefteorg Zintes oil refinery in the Orenburg region of the Russian Federation. That statement went on, we also have confirmation of what Ukraine managed to destroy in the strike. According to preliminary information, one of the primary oil processing units, APU, was hit. Such units are vital. Without them, crude cannot be converted into usable products. This strike, Ukraine emphasizes, directly targets Russia's ability to supply its troops with fuel. In addition to these refinery strikes, Ukraine turned its focus to the oil logistics chain. In occupied Crimea, a terminal at Feodosia, Theodosia, used by Russia to transport fuel by sea to the peninsula and to southern occupied territories, was hit, according to Ukrainian sources. Also hit was JSC Marine Oil Terminal, a key hub for the supply of fuel and lubricants by sea to the Crimean Peninsula and the temporarily occupied territories of southern Ukraine. It was reported that several storage tanks at the site were destroyed or damaged, tanks most likely holding refined fuel destined for use in Russian-occupied areas. While full damage assessments are pending, the impact is clear. The supply tail, once taken for granted, is now vulnerable. All told, it was a very bad night for Russian oil. But in truth, it's been a bad few months. Ukraine has steadily accelerated its campaign against Russia's oil refining capacity, focusing not just on refineries, but now on storage and export terminals. The scale of the impact is significant. Analysts at the International Energy Agency and elsewhere have documented how repeated attacks by Ukrainian drones have eroded Russia's refining base and forced Moscow to divert fuel meant for export into domestic or military supply. In the short term, this means that Russia is producing fewer of these refined products. For Russia, the war machine requires diesel for armored vehicles, gasoline for support vehicles, aviation fuel for jets, lubricants for maintenance. All these come from refined product output. When those are constrained, offensive potential weakens. Moreover, what remains is mostly used internally, either for Russian domestic use or for military deployments, leaving less available for export. One recent estimate from the Zelensky administration claims that Ukraine's long-range strikes have cut Russia's refining capacity by around 20%. In effect, Russia is now facing a double whammy. First, Ukraine is hitting its refining and logistic infrastructure. Second, its export market is showing signs of shifting away. The result, less refining, fewer exports, weaker revenue, and a harder time fueling its war machine. And behind all of this is the message of accountability when the US, via the Donald J. Trump administration, begins imposing new sanctions on Russian oil majors and warns countries like China and India of secondary consequences. The calculus shifts. Chinese companies evidently do not want to risk sanctions or trade retaliation simply to keep buying heavily discounted Russian oil. At the same time, Russia can't rely solely on selling crude. It needs to sell refined products too, and those are precisely the facilities Ukraine is hitting. Domestically, the ripples of these strikes are mounting in Russia. In Crimea and other annexed regions, there have been reported petrol shortages and rising fuel prices. Analysts say that Moscow may have to subsidize oil companies to divert production from exports to domestic supply in order to stabilize markets and prevent public dissatisfaction or fuel-led unrest. One expert writing for the London-based policy institute Chatham House noted, "More attacks on Russia's oil refining offer Ukraine its best possible defense against Russia's focus on Ukraine's energy infrastructure." So where does this leave Russia's leader, President Vladimir Putin? The saving grace might appear to be that Russia still has huge reserves of crude oil, raw, unrefined. And indeed, crude remains the one product Russia can still sell and has continued to do so. In 2024, Russia reportedly exported millions of barrels per day of oil products despite sanctions. But crude alone isn't enough for two reasons. One, the refining bottleneck makes it harder to convert into profitable or usable fuel. Two, key buyers and refiners are showing signs of shifting behavior. If large buyers like China reduce or halt Russian oil purchases, the discount will widen further, revenues will shrink, and the war economy will feel the squeeze. Revenues will shrink and the war economy will feel the squeeze. For Ukraine, the strategy seems straightforward. Hit the vulnerable points of the adversary's supply chain, target the energy logistics that enable the fighting machine, and exploit the cracks of buyer behavior and diplomatic subsidies that Russia relies on. One British policy institute summarized it. It's all about replying to Russia's pressure with the pressure of Ukraine's own. As Ukraine ramps up its long-range drone and missile capability, striking deep inside Russian territory, Russia will have to allocate more resources to defending its rear areas, more fuel to domestic supply or military uses, and fewer exportable products, all of which degrade its offensive capacity. From here, the question is, will this pressure be sustained long enough to create a tipping point? The damage done to refineries and oil terminals is immediate, but whether the export market shift becomes permanent remains to be seen. If China and other big buyers fully step away from Russian supply, it could mark a structural change. However, if China judges that its trade relationship with the US is more important, it may resume Russian purchases once diplomatic lines are clearer. For now, though, the signs are bleak for Russia's oil-fueled war economy. With the combination of deep strikes inside Russia, disrupted logistics, and shrinking external demand, the pressure on President Putin mounts. In the words of one analyst, Russia's crude oil accounts for almost 20% of China's energy imports. Yet another 80% comes from other countries, a reminder that China has options and that Russia is not indispensable. Meanwhile, if refiners like Yanchang persist in avoiding Russian crude, despite deep discounts, e.g. Ural crude trading at approximately $4 per barrel cheaper than Brent, the loss of millions or even billions in revenue looms. The message is clear. This isn't merely an isolated attack or a temporary supply disruption. It is part of a broader strategic campaign of attrition on energy resources, on export markets, on fuel logistics that targets the very backbone of Russia's ability to wage war.